Everyone laughed at the quiet woman at the shooting range until her first shot shocked the champion. They thought she was weak. They thought she was a joke. But when the trigger pulled, everything changed. A single bullet cut through silence and shattered the pride of the man no one dared to challenge. What happened next left the entire range frozen, because the champion's crown was about to fall. Welcome back to HOA Unit. I'm Daniel, a homeowner in the suburbs. I live in a neighborhood where the HOA thinks they control everything, and every day feels like a battlefield of rules and secrets. But today, I want to tell you a different kind of story. A story of silence, of laughter, of pride, and of the moment one quiet woman turned it all upside down. Welcome back to HOA Unit. I'm Daniel, a simple man living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My life is surrounded by rules, letters, and petty fights with the HOA, but every now and then, I see stories. Strange stories. Stories that remind me how people judge too quickly and lose too easily. This one, it stayed with me. Because it wasn't just about shooting targets. It was about pride. It was about silence. It was about how the loudest voices can crumble in front of the quietest strength. I remember walking into the shooting range that day. The air was heavy with gunpowder. The walls carried echoes of bullets. Every shot sounded like thunder inside that narrow hall. But the real noise, the real weight, was not the guns. It was the laughter, the whispers, the mocking smiles that floated around me like smoke. The champion stood at the far end. He had that look, that untouchable aura, like he owned the place, like every target on the wall already belonged to him, and me. I was just a quiet visitor, not dressed like them, not speaking like them, no, but even carrying my own gear. I could feel the eyes on me, measuring me, doubting me. And then came the chuckles, small at first, then louder. Look at her. She won't even hit the board. She'll drop the gun before she shoots. I didn't answer. I didn't smile. I just walked forward, calm and steady. And maybe that silence made them laugh even harder. The champion leaned back against the counter, arms folded, chin high. His smile was sharp, like a blade. He didn't even need to speak. His eyes said everything. This was his world, and I was trespassing. The rules of suburbia are strange. People judge you by your lawn, by your mailbox, by your car parked in the wrong spot. And here, they judged me before I even touched a gun. It was all the same game: power, control, pride. I could hear the voices, men nudging each other, women whispering into each other's ears. Someone even pulled out a phone, ready to record my failure. They wanted a show. They wanted me to be the clown, but I wasn't there to play their part. I wasn't there to feed their laughter. I had come for something else. And I knew my silence would speak louder than their noise. I stepped up to the line. The gun was placed in my hand, cold steel, heavy but familiar. I raised it slowly, and the room grew louder. Jokes bounced off the walls. Their words didn't touch me, not anymore. My eyes locked on the target, the circle in the center, so small, so far, but clear, sharp, waiting for me. The champion leaned forward. I could feel his stare burning on the side of my face. He wanted me to miss. He needed me to miss, because if I didn't, his kingdom would shake. I took a breath, the kind of breath that empties everything inside. The laughter faded, the whispers blurred, even the smell of gunpowder disappeared. It was just me. And the silence before the storm. I pulled the trigger. The sound ripped through the hall. The bull, it cut the air. The target rattled against the wall. Then came silence, not the mocking kind, not the arrogant kind, but real silence, the kind that makes hearts stop. The shot had landed, not on the edge, not near the circle, but dead center, a perfect hit. My hand lowered the gun slowly, and I looked around the room. Their eyes were wide, their mouths open. Even the phones had stopped recording. The champion's smile was gone, his jaw clenched tight, his arms unfolded. For the first time, he looked unsure that one shot had cracked something in the air. The same people who laughed now whispered differently. She hit it. Dead center. No way. I stayed quiet, because I didn't need their words. The target had spoken for me. The champion walked forward. He checked the target, his eyes narrowed, but there was no denying it, the record he held. The pride he wore like a crown had just been touched, and this was only my first shot. I could feel the shift in the room, from laughter to disbelief, from mockery to respect, from arrogance to fear. But here's the thing. It wasn't just about a bullet and a board. It was about all those moments in life when people laugh at you, when they judge you before they even know you, when they wait for you to fail. And then you don't. You rise. You strike. You prove them wrong without saying a word. That's what this moment was. A mirror. A reminder that silence can be louder than noise, and that even the strongest champion can fall with a single shot. I stood there, still holding the gun, the champion staring at me like I had stolen something from him. And maybe I had. Because what is pride? If not fragile, what is arrogance? If not breakable? The crowd didn't know what to do. Clap, cheer, or stay frozen. So they did nothing. They just stared, and I walked away. Calm, steady, like I had walked in because I didn't need their applause. Their silence was a no. It was the sweetest sound in the world. But now, I want to ask you something. If you were standing there that day, watching a quiet stranger break the champion's record with a single shot, would you clap for her courage, or would you stay silent like the rest? Tell me in the comments, because maybe your answer says more than you think. The silence after my first shot still hung in the air. It was heavy, almost suffocating. Like the walls themselves couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. I could feel their stares, some filled with shock, some with doubt, and some with quiet anger. The champion stood there, frozen for a second longer than he wanted. His eyes stayed locked on the target, as if staring harder would change the hole in the center. But the truth was burned into that paper circle. He had no control over it anymore. I looked at him, just for a moment, and in that single glance, I saw something crack behind his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was disbelief, like his world had tilted and he didn't know how to stand on it anymore. The others, they shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed now. No one whispered too loudly. The same mouths that had mocked me stayed sealed. The room had changed, and I hadn't even spoken a word. The instructor's voice broke the silence. "Good shot," he said softly, almost careful with his tone. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement, a statement he couldn't deny. I placed the gun back down, slow and steady. My hands didn't shake. My breathing was calm, but inside, I felt the weight of every stare pressing on me. They had all built their confidence on the champion's pride, and with one pull of a trigger, I had shaken their foundation. The champion finally spoke. "One shot doesn't mean anything." His voice was steady, but thinner than before, like he was forcing strength into it. He walked closer to the counter, picked up his own gun, and fired at the target without hesitation. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots ripped through the air. The crowd leaned forward, eager to see. The board shook again, but when the dust cleared, the holes weren't as perfect as mine, close, but not center. The whispers returned, but they sounded different now, not mocking, not confident, but uncertain. The champion's jaw tightened. He placed his gun down hard, the metal clattering louder than it needed to. He turned back to me, his eyes sharp. "Try again," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply picked the gun back up. The cold metal felt the same, but the air, oh, the air felt different now. Every eye was on me, not waiting for failure anymore, but waiting for proof. Proof that my first shot wasn't luck. Proof that silence could really be stronger than noise. I took another breath, let the world fade, and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore forward. The sound echoed. The target jumped. Another hit, another perfect center. The room gasped, a sound so small, yet louder than any laughter before. The champion's face went pale for just a moment. He masked it quickly, but I saw it. The flicker of fear, the tremor of doubt. I lowered the gun again. No smile, no words, just silence. And in that silence, the crowd didn't know where to stand. Some looked at me with admiration, some with resentment, some avoided my eyes entirely because silence makes people uncomfortable. And now I was no longer the joke, I was the storm they didn't expect. The champion cleared his throat. "This is my range," he said, his tone firmer now. But it sounded like a shield, like he was trying to protect himself more than threaten me. "This is my record, my place, my people." I let him speak. I let him hold on to the last pieces of his pride, because I knew it wasn't mine to take. It was already slipping through his fingers. The whisper grew again, not jokes this time, but questions. Who is she? Where did she come from? Does she train here? The mystery wrapped around me like armor, because the less I said, the more they filled the silence with their own fears. The champion picked up his gun again. His movements were sharper now, faster, almost desperate. He fired once more. The shot landed close to center, but not enough. Not the same, not perfect. I could feel the anger rolling off him now, not at me, but at himself, at the reality he couldn't control, at the crown slipping off his head. I didn't laugh, I didn't cheer, I didn't even gloat, because I didn't need to. The quiet woman had already spoken, not with words, not with arrogance, but with the clean hole in the target that no one could deny. The champion turned his back on me, walked away from the counter, and for the first time, the room didn't follow him. They followed me with their eyes instead. I stayed calm, still, silent, because silence is heavier than noise, and in that silence, the champion's kingdom had already fallen. But let me ask you this. If you were in that room, watching the champion lose his crown shot by shot, would you stand by him out of loyalty? Or would you shift your eyes to the stranger who just shattered his record? Whose side would you choose? Tell me in the comments, because I really want to know how you would stand in that silence. The champion's footsteps echoed as he walked away. But even in his silence, the tension grew heavier. It wasn't victory I felt in that moment. It was the weight of every eye in the room, some filled with awe, some filled with anger, and some with jealousy. Because power doesn't just belong to the one who holds it. It belongs to the people who believe in it. And I had just broken their belief. That's when the first mocking laugh slipped through again. Not from the champion, but from one of his loyal followers, a tall man in the corner, arms crossed, smirk sharp. "Two lucky shots don't make you a champion," he sneered. His words hung in the air, daring me to respond. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. My silence unsettled him, because he wanted a fight, but I wasn't going to give it to him. Another voice joined in, this one sharper, nastier. She probably practiced all week for this one moment, just to show off. Laughter rippled through the group again, thin laughter, forced laughter, the kind that hides fear. I could see the cracks forming in their confidence. They wanted to believe I was nothing. They needed to believe it, because if they didn't, then everything they stood for, everything they followed, would fall apart. The champion returned slowly, his face calm again, but his eyes betrayed him. He had regained his composure, but inside, he was bleeding. Still, he smiled at me, not the smile of victory, but the smile of a man planning his revenge. You think you can stand here, in my range, in front of my people, and take what's mine? He said softly. The words weren't for the crowd. They were for me. They were a warning and a threat. I picked up the gun again, not because I wanted to answer him, but because I wanted the silence to speak louder. The metal felt even colder now, like it carried the weight of the room's hatred and disbelief. I aimed, breathed, and fired. The bullet tore into the target, another perfect hit. The laughter stopped. The whispers turned to gasps. Even the man who mocked me before shifted back into his seat. The silence swallowed them all whole. The champion's smile faltered again, for just a moment, and in that moment, I saw the truth. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of losing himself, because without his crown, without his record, who was he? He stepped closer to me, his voice low, sharp like a knife. You don't belong here. His words were poison, meant to push me out, meant to remind me I was an outsider. But that's the thing about silence. It belongs everywhere, and no one can take it away. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, the gun still in my hand, and in that stillness, his anger grew because he realized he couldn't control me. Not with words, not with threats, not even with the weight of his reputation. The crowd shifted again. Some were restless, some avoided looking at him, some began to look at me with quiet respect. The loyalty he once commanded was slipping, shot by shot. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about the shooting range anymore. It was about power. It was about the way people build kings out of arrogance and tear them down when the silence exposes their weakness. The champion fired again. Bang, bang, bang. The bullets landed close, but not perfect. Every miss cut deeper into his pride. Every near shot made his hands shake more. And every imperfection reminded the crowd of the truth they didn't want to see. He was human. He was breakable. And his crown was nothing more than paper. When I fired again, the bullet kissed the same hole as before. Perfect. Unshakable. The man in the corner muttered something under his breath. The laughter was gone. The whispers were gone. All that remained was silence, and the silence belonged to me. The champion lowered his gun, his arms heavy, his chest rising fast. He wouldn't admit it, not yet, but he knew his record was gone. His throne was cracking, and his people were no longer only his. I set the gun down again, calm, steady, silent, and I looked at him. Not with arrogance, not with cruelty, but with the quiet power of someone who doesn't need to prove anything anymore. That's when I saw it. The look in his eyes, not anger, not fear, but desperation. The kind of desperation that comes when a man feels his empire slipping away. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't going to end with just shots and targets. It was going to become something bigger, something heavier. Because pride doesn't fall quietly, it claws and screams on its way down. The champion turned away again, his steps heavy, the room tense. No one dared to laugh now, no one dared to whisper, and yet I could feel it. The storm wasn't over, it was only just beginning. But let me ask you this. If you saw a man, once untouchable, once praised by all, begin to crumble in front of you, would you reach out to save him from falling, or would you let him collapse under the weight of his own pride? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the answer says more about us than we realize. The room was thick with silence, not the calm kind, but the kind that presses against your skin, the kind that makes every breath feel louder than it should. The champion had stepped back again, his gun lowered, his pride shaking, and the crowd didn't know where to look. Some stared at the floor, some at me, and some still clung to him, hoping his crown hadn't yet fallen. I stood at the line, the gun heavy in my hand, but the weight wasn't from the steel, it was from their expectations. Every single one of them waited to see if I could do it again, if I could keep breaking the man they had built up like a god. The champion's voice cut through the silence. "Go ahead," he said. Almost daring me, his tone carried a challenge, but also a plea, as if he needed me to fail. Just once, so he could breathe again. I didn't answer. I raised the gun slowly. My eyes locked on the target, the circle, small, steady, waiting. The world faded again. The whispers blurred. The tension melted into one thin line of focus. It was just me. And the silence before the shot. The crowd leaned in. The champion clenched his fists, and I breathed. The trigger pulled, the sound thundered through the hall. The target shook. Another hit. Another perfect shot. Gasps filled the room again. A sound sharp enough to cut the air. The same people who once mocked me now stared at me like I was something impossible. The champion stepped forward, fast, like he needed to prove something. He fired his own shot. Bang! It landed close. But not enough, not the center, not perfect. His jaw clenched tighter, his breathing heavier, and I realized it wasn't just the shots that were breaking him, it was the silence that followed mine, because in that silence, he couldn't hide from the truth. He fired again, and again, but the hole spread farther from the center, his control slipping with every pull, and the more he missed, the more the crowd began to shift. I watched their eyes, the same eyes that once worshipped him, now uncertain, restless, because loyalty is fragile and admiration is fickle. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I just raised the gun again and fired once more, perfect. The bullet slid into the same circle, like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for me all along. The champion froze, his shoulders dropped for just a second, and in that second, he wasn't a champion anymore, he was just a man drowning in silence. The room was buzzing now, but it wasn't laughter, it wasn't mockery, it was awe, fear, curiosity. Who was I? How could I? Where did I come from? Questions floated in their eyes but never reached their lips. The champion slammed his gun down on the counter. The sound rattled like thunder. Everyone flinched, even me, because anger carries its own kind of weight, and his pride had finally cracked wide open. He turned toward me, his eyes dark, desperate. "You don't belong here," he said again, but softer this time, almost broken, almost begging. I stood still, calm, steady, silent, because belonging isn't given, it's taken. And with every shot, I had already carved my place into their world. The instructor cleared his throat nervously, like he wanted to calm the storm before it broke the room apart. "Maybe that's enough for today," he suggested, but no one listened. Not me, not the champion, not the crowd, because this wasn't just shooting anymore, this was war. A war of silence and pride, a war of power and downfall. The champion grabbed his gun again, hands shaking now. He fired wildly, bang, bang, bang. The shots tore into the board, but none hit center, not one, and with each miss, the crowd slipped further from his control. Their eyes drifted toward me, not with laughter, not with pity, but with something heavier, recognition, respect, fear. He had lost them, and he knew it. I raised the gun one last time, not for him, not for them, but for myself, for the silence that had carried me this far. I breathed, pulled the trigger, and when the shot landed center again, the room erupted in silence, a silence so thick It was louder than thunder. The champion dropped his gun. It clattered against the counter, and his head fell into his hands. He didn't need to speak. Everyone could see. His crown was gone. I placed the gun back gently, turned, and began to walk away. The crowd parted like water. No one laughed anymore. No one dared to speak, because silence had won. But let me ask you this. If you were standing there that day, watching pride crumble and silence rise, would you cheer for the fall of the champion? Or would you stay quiet, respecting the man he once was? Tell me in the comments, because maybe your answer reveals the kind of person you truly are. The sound of his gun hit. The counter still rang in my ears. It was heavier than any shot fired that day, because it wasn't just metal dropping, it was pride. It was a crown falling to the ground. The champion stood there, frozen, his chest rising fast, his hands trembling. The silence around him was crushing, and for the first time, everyone saw him not as a legend, but as a man. I should have felt victory. I should have felt power. But what I felt was something else, the weight of the room pressing against me, dozens of eyes locked on me, searching for something, answers, explanations, a reason for how this had happened, because in their world, he was untouchable, and I had touched the one thing no one else could. I looked at the target board, 3 perfect holes, lined almost on top of each other, as if the board itself had bowed to me. It wasn't just accuracy, it was control. It was silence turned into precision. The instructor walked forward slowly. He checked the board, leaned closer, shook his head softly. "Never seen anything like this," he whispered, but the whisper carried. The whole room heard it, and the whisper was heavier than a shout. The champion lifted his head, his face pale, eyes hollow. For a moment, he looked at me like he didn't recognize me, like I was something that had crawled out of his nightmare. He tried to speak. His lips moved, but no words came out, and in that silence, I knew his record wasn't just broken, his pride wasn't just cracked, his very identity had shattered. He had been the king of this place, his throne built on fear and admiration, but what is a king? When his crown lies in pieces, he turned sharply, walked past the crowd. No one followed, not one step. And that was the truest loss, because a champion without followers is only a man with a gun. The crowd remained still. Some stared at him, some stared at me, but most stared at the target board, the center holes shining back at them, proof that their belief had been wrong all along. I lowered the gun once more, placing it gently on the counter, the sound soft, yet it cut through the air like thunder, because the smallest sound, after true silence, feels the loudest. The man who mocked me earlier tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked. It wasn't humor. It was fear. Fear of silence. Fear of change. Fear of seeing the truth he didn't want to see. I didn't respond, because I had already spoken. Every bullet was a word. Every shot was a sentence, and the story was written clearly on the board. The instructor turned to me. "Who taught you?" he asked, his voice steady, but his eyes wide. The crowd leaned in, waiting for my answer, but I didn't give one, because silence was my shield. And the less I said, the more they wondered. Mystery is heavier than truth, and I carried that mystery like armor. I stepped back from the line, walked past the rows of eyes. Some moved aside quickly, some froze in place, but every one of them watched me, as if my steps were bullets too. The champion's gun still lay abandoned on the counter, cold, lonely, forgotten, once the symbol of power. Now nothing more than metal. I could have picked it up. I could have claimed it as my own. But I didn't. Because power isn't taken by force, it's taken by silence, and I already had more than enough. The air was heavy as I walked toward the exit. The crowd's whispers grew louder behind me, not mocking this time, not cruel, but full of wonder. Who is she? How did she do that? Will she come back? Their words followed me like shadows, but I didn't answer, because I knew the truth. The mystery mattered more than the explanation. I pushed open the door, The cool air outside washed over me, and for the first time, I felt it, the true weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just a shot. It wasn't just a record broken. It was a crown stolen, a kingdom shaken, and a silence louder than any applause. I looked up at the sky. The sun hung low, soft orange light spilling across the street, and I smiled for the first time. Not because I won, but because I never needed to win. I only needed to show them that silence can speak, that quiet can shatter walls, that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. I took a deep breath and walked away from the range, each step steady, calm, silent. Because the war wasn't with guns anymore. It was with memory. And memories never miss their mark. The champion would remember this day forever. The crowd would whisper it in corners, and even the walls of that range would carry the echoes, the day a quiet woman walked in and broke the record no one dared to touch. But let me ask you this. If you were the champion, and someone shattered the very thing that defined you, would you fight harder to reclaim it? Or would you walk away and let silence take your place? Tell me in the comments, because how you answer says what kind of fighter you truly are. His shadow followed me even outside the range. It stretched long against the pavement, but it wasn't mine. It was his. The champion's shadow clinging to me like it refused to die. I thought walking away would end it. I thought silence would be enough. But silence has a way of echoing louder than sound, and soon the echo reached me, because the very next day he came back. I was at the cafe across the street, the same little place with the cracked windows and the smell of burnt coffee that never went away. I liked it there. It was quiet, and quiet was my home. But that day, it wasn't quiet, because when he walked in, the air shifted, people whispered, chairs scraped. It wasn't the champion entering a cafe. It was a storm entering a room. He saw me immediately. His eyes locked on me like a target, no gun this time, but his stare was heavier than any bullet. He walked over slowly, every step loud against the floor, until he stood right at my table, and then, without asking, he sat down. The silence between us was sharp, like glass. I could feel every breath, every heartbeat, like the world had shrunk into this small corner booth. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You made me a ghost." I didn't answer, because what could I say? He was right. The man who once filled the range with power now felt invisible, and I had done that with nothing but silence. He slammed his hand on the table. The cups rattled, heads turned, but no one interrupted, because they wanted to see, they wanted to hear. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This is all I have, the record, the name, the respect. Without it, I am nothing." His voice cracked at the last word, and for the first time, he wasn't a champion. He wasn't a legend. He was just a man breaking apart. I watched his hands tremble. The same hands that once held steady under pressure, now shaking like leaves in the wind, and I felt something strange, not triumph, not satisfaction, but pity, because I realized the crown I had shattered was also the cage that trapped him. He had lived too long as a champion, too long defined by numbers on a board, too long feeding on applause, and now, stripped of it, he didn't know who he was. The silence stretched between us until I finally spoke, soft, steady, simple. "Maybe you should stop being the champion and start being yourself." His eyes widened, like I had spoken a language he had never heard before. He leaned back slowly, breathing heavy, as if the words themselves had weight. But then He laughed. Not a happy laugh, not a cruel laugh, but a hollow, broken laugh. The sound of someone who had just seen their reflection crack in a mirror. "You don't get it," he said. "Without this, I am nobody, and nobody listens to nobodies." He stood up sharply, the chair screeching across the floor, and without another word, he walked out. The cafe fell silent. Every face turned toward me, eyes filled with questions they would never ask, and in that silence, I knew this wasn't over, because when a man loses his crown, he either builds a new one or burns the kingdom to ashes. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my head, the broken laughter, the hollow voice, the way his hands trembled like a dying flame. Was I the one who killed the flame, or was I the one who showed it was already fading? The next morning, I returned to the range. I didn't plan to shoot. I only wanted to see, to listen, to feel the weight of the place again. And when I stepped inside, I saw him. He was already there, gun in hand, eyes focused on the target. Alone at the farthest lane, I stayed in the shadows, watching silently, and what I saw shook me more than any bullet ever could. He fired, again and again, but the shots were wild, off target, scattered like broken glass, each miss carved deeper into him. I could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the twitch in his jaw, the way he gritted his teeth. Every miss was a cut, and he was bleeding pride onto the floor. Finally, after the last shot, he lowered the gun and just stood there, frozen, empty. The board showed it all. A wide spread of holes, none touching the center, none close to perfect. The whispers began again. The crowd had grown. People watched from behind the glass. They shook their heads, murmured to one another. And I knew this was the death of a legend, because legends don't die quietly. They die in front of everyone. I turned away because I couldn't watch anymore. I had already done enough, and yet, a part of me wondered, did I save him? By breaking him? Or did I destroy the only thing he had left? And now I ask you, if you had the power to end someone's crown, to strip them of the very thing that defined them, would you do it? Or would you let them keep their throne? Even if it was built on fear and lies, tell me in the comments, because your answer will reveal if you believe in mercy or justice. The air inside the range was heavy that day, but the weight wasn't mine anymore. It was his. The champion stood in the far lane, surrounded by whispers that once were cheers, his shoulders bent, his eyes hollow, and his hands no longer steady. I thought I could leave it there, let the silence finish the story. But silence has a way of following you, and this silence, it followed me everywhere, at the cafe, in the parking lot, even in my dreams. The image of him missing the target, the sound of hollow laughter, the echo of his words, "Without this, I am nothing." I began to wonder, had I taken his crown, or had I taken his life in pieces? Days passed, but the whispers only grew louder. People in the neighborhood talked, at the grocery store, at the gas station, everywhere I went. The champion lost his touch. Did you hear about the woman at the range? He's finished. I never told them it was me, but deep down, they knew. And the more they knew, the heavier the silence became. One evening, I went back to the range. The sun was low, the parking lot nearly empty, and yet, his car was there. I stepped inside quietly, and there he was, alone again, gun in hand, shooting at shadows. The board was covered in holes, wild, messy, desperate, but his face told the real story. It wasn't anger any more. It was despair. I stood at the doorway, watching as he fired one last round. The bullet hit low, far from the center, and he lowered the gun slowly, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. Then he turned, His eyes met mine across the empty hall, and in that moment, there were no titles, no records, no crowns, just two people staring at each other. One who broke the silence, and one who was broken by it. He walked toward me, each step slow, dragging, until he stood just a few feet away. His voice was quiet, softer than I'd ever heard. "You don't know what you've done." I didn't move, I didn't speak, because I didn't know if he meant it as blame or as truth. He placed the gun on the counter, the same counter where mine had once rested, and he looked at it, like it no longer belonged to him. Then he whispered, "I'm done." He turned and walked past me, out the door, into the fading light, and for the first time, the range was truly silent. I stood there for a long time, looking at the abandoned gun, the holes scattered across the board, the empty space he had left behind, and it hit me. Sometimes the greatest victory doesn't feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like standing in the ashes of what once was. I had broken the champion, but in doing so, I had also broken the world he built, and now, I wondered if silence could heal what silence had destroyed. Weeks passed. His name faded from the walls. No more stories about his records. No more whispers of his glory. Only shadows of what used to be. The new shooters came, young faces eager for a crown, but none of them carried the weight he once did. None of them filled the room the way he had. And me, I stayed quiet, still shooting in silence, still carving words into boards with bullets. But now, the stares were different. No longer disbelief, no longer mockery, but respect, mixed with fear, because they didn't just see a woman with a steady aim, they saw the one who ended the champion, and that is heavier than any crown sometimes. I ask myself if I regret it, if I should have missed on purpose, if I should have let him keep his kingdom a little longer. But then I remember, a crown built on lies cannot last forever, and silence always speaks the loudest truth. Now when I step into that range, the air feels different, not heavy, not hostile, but waiting, as if the walls themselves wonder, will there ever be another like him or another like me? And maybe that's the point. It was never about winning, never about records. It was about the silence in between the shots, the silence that can build or destroy. So I leave you with this. If you had the power to break someone's crown, knowing it could also break their soul, would you do it anyway? Or would you hold your fire and let the silence remain unbroken? Tell me in the comments, because your answer will show if you believe strength comes from winning or from restraint.